In 1938, it shattered 8 world speed records and made Nazi Germany proud. By 1940, it was a flying coffin, too slow for modern air combat, a death trap in daylight. But the very weakness that doomed this seaplane in open war turned it into one of the most secret, most dangerous weapons of World War II. Both sides used it. Neither side admitted it. This is the true story of the Heinkel He 115. Chapter 1. The fastest thing on water. Picture the Baltic Sea in the spring of 1938. The water is flat and cold, the sky is pale, and on a stretch of open coastline a crowd of German engineers, military officers, and journalists are holding their breath. A strange-looking aircraft sits on the water, twin floats, twin engines, a long slender fuselage. Wings that seem too elegant for something meant to carry bombs and torpedoes. It taxis, it lifts, and within minutes it does something no seaplane has ever done before. It goes fast, shockingly fast, over a closed circuit of 1,000 kilometers, then 2,000 kilometers. This aircraft posts speeds of over 328 kilometers per hour, better than 204 miles per hour. Nothing that takes off and lands on water has ever flown like this. By the time the trials are finished, this single aircraft has broken 8 separate world records for seaplanes. 8, in one type, in one testing campaign. This is the Heinkel He 115, and in the spring of 1938, it is arguably the most advanced maritime aircraft on the planet. The story of how it got here begins 3 years earlier, in 1935, when the German Air Ministry issues a requirement for a new twin engine, all-metal, long-range reconnaissance and torpedo bomber float plane, something that can patrol the sea lanes, hunt shipping, lay mines, and strike with torpedoes, all while operating from open water rather than a paved runway. 2 companies compete for the contract: Hamburger Flugzeugbau, with a design called the Ha 140, and Ernst Heinkel's company, with a sleek, low-drag monoplane. Heinkel wins. The first prototype takes to the air in August 1937, and it is immediately clear that this is not just another lumbering patrol plane. It is fast, it is stable, it has genuinely long range, over 2,000 kilometers, more than 1,300 miles, and it can be configured to carry serious ordnance. Up to 5 250-kilogram bombs, or a single aerial torpedo weighing 800 kilograms. To claim the speed records, engineers strip the aircraft down. They remove the glazed nose paneling that would normally house a bomb aimer's position. They smooth every surface they can, and they push the twin BMW 132 engines to their limit. The result that day on the Baltic is a sensation. German propaganda seizes on it immediately. Here is proof. The newsreels declare that German aviation engineering has no equal. Orders start arriving from abroad. Sweden wants some, Finland wants some, and a small, quiet, deeply pragmatic country called Norway, sitting on the edge of the North Atlantic with one of the longest coastlines in Europe, and barely any paved runways to speak of, decides that a fast, long-range seaplane is exactly what it needs to patrol its endless, ice-cold fjords. Norway places an order for 6 of them. Nobody in that crowd on the Baltic, not the engineers, not the officers, not the journalists scribbling notes for tomorrow's headlines, has any idea what this aircraft is about to become. Nobody imagines that within 4 years, these same airframes will be flying clandestine missions for the very people they were designed to fight for. Nobody imagines a single Heinkel He 115, painted in fake Luftwaffe markings, sneaking into enemy harbors in broad daylight to pluck out spies. Nobody imagines one of these aircraft simply vanishing in a fireball off the coast of Malta, its wreckage not found for 60 years. And nobody, absolutely nobody, imagines that the country whose flag is painted on its tail, Nazi Germany, will one day lose control of some of its own most advanced aircraft to a handful of furious, heartbroken pilots from a country it just invaded. But that is exactly what happens, and it starts with obsolescence. Chapter 2. Obsolete before the first shot is fired fast is a relative word. 328 kilometers per hour sounds impressive when you're comparing one floatplane to another floatplane. It sounds a great deal less impressive when you compare it to what is happening at the very same moment in the fighter squadrons of Britain and Germany. By 1939, the aircraft that will actually decide the Battle of Britain, the Supermarine Spitfire, the Messerschmitt Bf 109, are cruising into combat at speeds well over 560 kilometers per hour, more than 350 miles per hour. That is not a marginal difference. That is not, our plane is a little slower. That is the difference between a fighter and a target. When the Second World War officially begins in September 1939, the He 115 is instantly, brutally exposed. Its top speed of just over 200 miles per hour, so impressive against other seaplanes, makes it a lumbering, low, slow, easily spotted target the moment a modern fighter gets within visual range. In daylight, over open water, with no fighter escort worth the name, and He 115 is not a weapon. It is a target drone with a crew inside it. The Luftwaffe faces an uncomfortable choice. They have spent enormous resources developing and building this aircraft. It has genuine long range, a useful bomb and torpedo load, and the ability to land and take off from water anywhere along a coastline, a real tactical advantage in the right circumstances. But it cannot survive daylight combat against modern fighters. So the Luftwaffe does the only sensible thing. It hides the airplane in the dark. Beginning on the night of November 20th, 1939, He 115s start flying mine-laying sorties along the British coast, slipping in low over the water under cover of darkness to drop magnetic mines at the mouths of British rivers and harbors. Harwich, the Thames estuary, the approaches to major ports. It is quiet, unglamorous, and dangerous work, but it is work the He 115 can actually survive, because darkness erases its greatest weakness. No one can outturn a Spitfire they cannot see coming. As the war grinds on and Allied air defenses improve even over the night skies of Britain, the Luftwaffe pushes the He 115 further and further from danger north, into the brutal cold of the Arctic. Flying from bases in occupied Norway, He 115 squadrons are folded into the campaign against the Arctic convoys, the desperate, frozen supply runs carrying tanks, aircraft, fuel, and food from Britain and America around the top of the world to the Soviet Union. Here, in the endless twilight and howling weather of the far north, the He 115's long range and rugged construction actually suit it well. It becomes one of several aircraft types hunting convoy PQ-17 in July 1942, one of the most catastrophic convoy disasters of the entire war, in which the convoy was ordered to scatter and was subsequently torn apart by U-boats and aircraft, losing the majority of its ships and cargo. So by the middle of the war, the aircraft that once broke 8 world speed records has been quietly, systematically demoted, first from the daylight sky to the night sky, then from Western Europe to the Arctic. It is not that the He 115 is a bad aircraft. It is that the world moved faster than it did, and moving to the shadows was the only way it was allowed to keep flying at all. Which is, in a strange and almost poetic way, exactly the quality that is about to make it one of the most valuable aircraft in the entire war. Because there is one kind of mission where being slow, quiet, and able to land absolutely anywhere on open water is not a weakness at all. It is the perfect resume for a spy plane. But before we get to that story, the story that gives this aircraft its true, secret legacy, we need to talk about what happened in Norway. Because in April 1940, this aircraft is about to do something almost no other aircraft type did in the entire war. It is going to fight on both sides of the same battle, at the same time, over the same stretch of coastline. Chapter 3, 2 Air Forces, 1 airplane. Remember that Norwegian order, 6 He 115s, purchased before the war to patrol Norway's fjords. By early 1940, those aircraft are in Norwegian service, flown by Norwegian crews, operating out of Norwegian coastal bases. They are, by any measure, a small but capable maritime patrol force belonging to a neutral country that wants nothing to do with the war exploding around it. Neutrality does not save Norway. On the 9th of April 1940, Nazi Germany launches a full-scale invasion. landing troops and aircraft simultaneously at multiple points along the Norwegian coast in a campaign designed to seize the country before it can properly mobilize. Chaos erupts everywhere at once, on the ground and in the air. And in the middle of that chaos, something happens that sounds almost too strange to be true. Norwegian forces manage to capture 2 Luftwaffe He-115s. On the 10th of April, the very day after the invasion begins, German He-115s operating in support of the landings make emergency landings near the villages of Ornes and Brønnøysund, along the Norwegian coast. Whether through mechanical trouble, damage, navigation error, or simply being caught by Norwegian forces on the ground, these 2 Luftwaffe aircraft end up in Norwegian hands. And the Norwegians do not hesitate. They press the captured German aircraft into their own service, giving them the designations F-62 and F-64, and fly them, the exact same aircraft type as their own 6 He-115s, against the invading Germans for the remainder of the brief, doomed Norwegian campaign. Think about what that actually means, on the ground, in the air, in the confusion of April 1940. Along the coast of Norway, in the exact same weeks, Heinkel He 115 seaplanes wearing German crosses are flying missions to support the invasion, while Heinkel He 115 seaplanes wearing Norwegian markings, some of them literally captured from the enemy days earlier, are flying missions to stop them. The same airframe, the same engines, the same silhouette against the sky, on both sides of a life-or-death fight for a nation's survival. It is one of the strangest coincidences of the entire Second World War, and it barely gets a footnote in most history books. It cannot last. Norway's military, brave as it is, simply does not have the numbers, the modern equipment, or the air cover to hold back the German war machine. By June 1940, organized Norwegian resistance collapses, and the country falls under German occupation. For the Norwegian pilots who have spent the last 2 months flying and fighting in their He-115s, men who have watched their homeland invaded, who have flown against their own captured aircraft, who know they are about to lose everything, surrender is not an option they are willing to accept. They decide to run, and where they run to is going to change the entire story of this airplane. Chapter 4. 4 airplanes, 1 impossible flight. Here is the plan, and it is a genuinely desperate one. Fly the remaining He-115s, the last flyable Norwegian aircraft of this type, directly across the North Sea to Scotland. Not along the coast, not island hopping, straight across several hundred kilometers of open, hostile, U-boat-infested water, in aircraft that are now completely alone, with no fighter escort, no friendly radar coverage, and every chance of being intercepted by German patrol aircraft, or simply running out of fuel and ditching in the freezing sea. In June 1940, 4 Norwegian He-115s attempt exactly that flight. 4 aircraft, their crews fully aware that Norway has fallen, that their homes are now under occupation, and that this flight across open ocean may be the last free act they ever perform as members of an independent Norwegian military. They lift off from Norwegian waters, point their aircraft west, and fly for their lives across the North Sea. They make it, all the way to Scotland, to a base that will become known informally among the exiled Norwegians as the gathering point for this small, stubborn detachment. The Helensburgh Group, a handful of pilots and aircrew who refused to accept that the war was over just because their country had been occupied. Think about the sheer improbability of it. These are not fighter pilots in nimble aircraft with drop tanks designed for exactly this kind of long transit. These are floatplane crews, flying heavy twin-engine seaplanes across open sea, navigating by dead reckoning, with the very real possibility that a mechanical failure or a chance encounter with a German patrol would end the flight and their lives in the cold water below. And they did it anyway, because the alternative was living under occupation while their own aircraft, the very type they'd trained on, got flown by the people who had just taken their country. When they land in Scotland, they hand themselves and their aircraft over to British authorities and to the small, exiled Royal Norwegian Air Force being rebuilt on British soil. The British government's initial idea for these four He-115s is almost comically modest, given everything the aircraft is about to become. The plan is to use them for leaflet drops, flying over occupied Norway at night to scatter propaganda pamphlets encouraging resistance and reminding Norwegians that they had not been forgotten. Leaflets, that is the grand plan for four combat-capable, long-range seaplanes that had just completed a death-defying escape across the North Sea. But somebody in British intelligence looks at these aircraft and sees something else entirely. Somebody looks at a slow, quiet, long-range floatplane that can land on virtually any patch of open water anywhere on Earth, and realizes that slow and quiet is not always a weakness. Sometimes it is exactly what you need. If what you need is to sneak someone in or out of enemy territory without anybody noticing. And that is how three of these four Norwegian He-115s stop being obsolete patrol bombers and start becoming something far more valuable and far more dangerous: the private aircraft of British secret intelligence. Chapter 5. The makeover. Whoever within British intelligence made the call to repurpose these aircraft understood something important. If you are going to use a foreign, German-designed aircraft to conduct covert missions deep into enemy or enemy-adjacent territory, you cannot use it as it came off the assembly line. It needs to become something else entirely, faster where it can be made faster, longer-ranged, better armed for self-defense, and above all, invisible. Three of the four surviving Norwegian He-115s are pulled aside for a serious, deliberate conversion. Extra fuel tanks go in, stretching the already respectable range even further, because a covert insertion aircraft might need to fly deep and fly long without any chance of refueling along the way. Unnecessary cockpit glazing, panels that add weight, add reflections, add visibility to anyone looking for them, get stripped out. Defensive armament is upgraded dramatically. Instead of the aircraft's original light machine gun fit, engineers install 8 Browning machine guns, a serious increase in firepower for an aircraft that might need to fight its way out of trouble on a bad night. And finally, every one of these aircraft gets painted flat black from nose to tail, erasing any glint of reflected moonlight or searchlight that could give away its position to a watching gunner or a patrolling night fighter. What emerges from this process is no longer really a maritime patrol bomber. It is a bespoke, purpose-built infiltration aircraft, built out of a German airframe, modified by British engineers, and about to be flown into some of the most sensitive covert operations of the Mediterranean War, under a designation so obscure that most people who have studied the Second World War in detail have still never heard of it. Z Flight Chapter 6, Malta's Ghost Squadron, Malta, June 1941. If there is one place on Earth where the war is being fought out with absolute, grinding desperation in the summer of 1941, it is this tiny island fortress, sitting almost exactly in the middle of the Mediterranean, surrounded on all sides by Axis-controlled territory, bombed almost daily by Italian and German aircraft. Its supply convoys hunted mercilessly, its population enduring one of the most sustained bombardments any civilian population faced during the entire war. Malta matters enormously to both sides. It sits astride the supply routes feeding Axis forces in North Africa, and holding on to it, or losing it, could tip the balance of the entire North African campaign. Into this cauldron, in June 1941, comes one modified Norwegian He-115, carrying the British serial BV-185. Assigned to a unit so secret that its full activities were never officially acknowledged by the British government, even decades after the war ended. The unit's name, deliberately bland, deliberately forgettable, is Z Flight, based at Raif Kalafrana on Malta. At the controls is a Norwegian pilot named Håkon Offerdal, a man who has already lived through the fall of his country, the flight across the North Sea, and months of training and waiting, and who now finds himself flying one of the most unusual missions of the entire war. At night, over enemy-controlled water, wearing counterfeit German markings, ferrying secret agents into and out of North Africa. Picture the mission profile for a moment, because it is genuinely audacious. Under cover of darkness, Offerdal lifts his blacked-out, German look-alike seaplane off the water at Malta and flies south, toward the coast of North Africa, territory controlled, contested, or watched closely by Axis forces. Somewhere along that dark coastline, in a cove or an inlet chosen in advance, he brings the aircraft down onto open water, and in the pitch black, an agent, someone whose entire survival depends on absolutely nobody noticing this exchange, either climbs aboard or slips over the side and disappears into the darkness on his own. Then Offerdal lifts off again and flies home to Malta before the sun rises and before anyone with a set of binoculars and a working brain has a chance to ask what a German seaplane was doing, quietly puttering around in the dark near a neutral or contested stretch of coastline. It is exactly the kind of mission that the He 115's supposed weaknesses make possible. Too slow for daylight combat? Doesn't matter. This mission only happens at night. Not stealthy against radar or modern fighters. Doesn't matter. The entire point is to look, from a distance, exactly like the German aircraft that are supposed to be there. Limited by the need for a runway. The opposite is true. This aircraft doesn't need a runway at all, just open water, which the Mediterranean coastline has no shortage of. For months, this works. Z flight becomes one of the most tightly guarded secrets on an island that already keeps an enormous number of secrets. And then, in September 1941, it starts to go wrong. Chapter 7. Fire on the Water. In early July 1941, Italian bombers hit Calafrana and BV-185 takes damage on the ground, a stark reminder that even Malta's own harbor, home base for this supposedly invisible aircraft, is under constant threat from Axis air power. The aircraft is repaired, but the incident is a warning of just how thin the margin for error really is on an island under this kind of siege. By September, BV-185 is back in the air, and the operation gains an unexpected, almost novelistic new layer. Two of the pilots now flying test and mission flights in this modified Nazi seaplane are French escapees, Georges Blaise and Raoul Gatien, men who had themselves fled Vichy-controlled Bizerte in North Africa by stealing a French Loire 130 flying boat and making their own desperate escape to Allied territory. Now here they are, on the far side of one dramatic escape, flying a second nation's captured, modified, secretly repurposed enemy aircraft on clandestine missions back into the waters near where they themselves had just fled from. On the night of September 21st into the early hours of September 22nd, 1941, BV-185 takes off from Calafrana at 5 minutes past midnight, carrying Blaise, Gatien, and a Royal Navy observer, Sub-Lieutenant Reg Drake, from the ship HMS Grebe. It is a routine departure for an operation that, by this point, has already flown for months without disaster. Nobody expects what happens next. Roughly 23 miles north of Malta, something goes catastrophically wrong. Witnesses on the ground and on nearby vessels report the aircraft suddenly turning into a bright flash of light, an explosion, sudden and total, out over open black water in the dead of night. There is no combat reported in the area. No German night fighter claims an interception. No anti-aircraft fire is recorded nearby. The aircraft simply, inexplicably, comes apart in a fireball over the sea, and everyone aboard is lost. Recovery teams later find the bodies of the two French pilots. The cause of the explosion is never conclusively established. A fuel system failure, a stray munition, a catastrophic structural failure in an aircraft that has been stripped, modified, reinforced, and flown hard for months under brutal conditions are all plausible explanations, and none of them can be proven with certainty. What is certain is that Z Flight has just lost its first aircraft and 3 men in a mission that officially, on paper, was never supposed to have happened at all, which means that even the loss itself has to be handled with total secrecy. No public announcement, no official mourning, nothing that might tip off anyone watching that Britain had been running a clandestine seaplane operation out of Malta, using disguised German aircraft. For 62 years, BV-185 essentially disappears from history. Then, in December 2003, Maltese fishing trawlers working the waters roughly 20 miles north of the island net something unexpected in their fishing gear: flotation and structural components from an aircraft. When examined, they are positively identified as pieces of BV-185, the first physical evidence, found by accident by fishermen, who almost certainly had no idea what they'd pulled up. That this secret mission and this specific tragedy had actually happened. But Z flight does not end with BV-185. The mission is too valuable to abandon. A replacement is already being prepared. Chapter 8. The daylight raid on Tripoli harbor. On the 29th of October 1941, a second modified He-115, carrying the British serial BV-187, arrives to take over Z flight's operations, flown once again by Norwegian Lieutenant Håkon Offerdahl. If anything, BV-187's operational record over the following months is even bolder than its predecessors. Over roughly 7 missions, BV-187 successfully inserts and extracts secret agents along the coasts of Sicily and Italy, including, according to some accounts of the operation, agents disguised as women, adding another layer of careful deception to missions that already depend entirely on nobody looking too closely at anything. Each successful run is a small miracle of nerve and navigation, finding a specific stretch of dark coastline at night, in enemy or enemy-adjacent waters, landing a large twin-engine aircraft on open water without lights, making contact with an agent whose life depends on total silence, and getting back into the air and home again before daylight and German patrols make the whole enterprise suicidal. But the single most audacious mission attributed to BV-187 is different in kind from all the others, because it happens not under cover of darkness, but in broad daylight, inside an enemy-controlled harbor. According to the operational record, BV-187 flies directly into Tripoli harbor, a working port controlled by Axis forces in North Africa, in full daylight, wearing its counterfeit German Luftwaffe markings, and picks up 2 Allied agents right there, in the open, under the noses of whoever happened to be watching the harbor that day. It is an almost unbelievable piece of nerve, relying entirely on the disguise, on the assumption that nobody looking at a German-marked seaplane puttering around a German-controlled harbor would think twice about it, when in fact it was flown by a Norwegian pilot working for British intelligence, extracting spies from literally inside the enemy's own front door. It is the kind of mission that sounds like fiction. It is also exactly the kind of mission that this specific, otherwise obsolete aircraft type was uniquely suited to fly, because nobody expects an enemy aircraft to be, secretly, yours. BV-187's success, though, breeds a kind of complacency that will prove fatal. And the danger, when it finally comes, does not come from the enemy spotting the disguise. It comes from someone on Z flight's own side deciding to take an unnecessary risk. Chapter 9. The Joyride That Ended Everything. By February 1942, Z flight's commanding officer at Malta has flown, overseen, and lived inside this secret operation for months. And, according to the accounts that survive, he makes a decision that has nothing to do with intelligence gathering, nothing to do with agents or extractions or wartime necessity, and everything to do with the simple, human temptation of having an unusual, powerful aircraft at his personal disposal and wanting, just once, to take it out for the thrill of it. He takes BV-187 up for what amounts to a joyride, and crucially, he does it in daylight. This is the one rule that Z flight's entire operational logic depends on never being broken. BV-187 survives specifically because it only flies where and when the disguise, the darkness, and the assumption of, it's just a German aircraft, can protect it. Take that protection away, fly in daylight, where actual German fighter pilots can get a good, long look at an aircraft that is supposed to belong to their own air force, and the entire premise collapses. It collapses immediately and fatally. German Messerschmitt Bf 109 fighters, reportedly from 6th Staffel of Jagdgeschwader 53, spot the aircraft, and something about it is wrong enough, or suspicious enough, or simply unfamiliar enough, that they move to intercept. They catch BV-187 as it comes in toward its moorings at Calafrana, and they open fire. Some accounts describe the aircraft being strafed and set alight at its moorings after returning. Regardless of the precise final seconds, the outcome is the same. BV-187 is destroyed, sinking in flames in the same waters it had used as a secret base for months. With that, Z-Flight's core operational strength is gone. 2 of its 3 purpose-modified aircraft have now been lost. One to a mysterious mid-air explosion that claimed 3 lives. The other to a moment of reckless personal indulgence by the very officer responsible for keeping the operation alive and secret. The unit that had pulled off nighttime infiltrations across contested Mediterranean waters and a full daylight extraction from inside an enemy harbor is effectively finished, undone not by superior enemy tradecraft, but by ordinary human error and a taste for unnecessary risk. Chapter 10. The last of the line that leaves 2 more of the original Helensburgh Group aircraft, and neither of them meets a kinder end. BV-184, crewed by Norwegian pilot Lieutenant Knut Skavhaugen, Canadian observer John Everach, and wireless operator and gunner Frank Gilbert, conducts a shorter run of operations from Malta between March and May 1942. Its war very nearly ends the way so many wartime tragedies do, not through enemy action at all, but through friendly fire. Flying an aircraft that by design is meant to look exactly like a German machine, BV-184 comes under attack from Allied Polish fighter pilots who, understandably given the entire point of the disguise, mistake it for genuine Luftwaffe hardware and open fire. The aircraft survives the encounter and is eventually withdrawn, returning to England on the 31st of May, 1942, its Malta service over. Its final fate is almost anticlimactic after everything that came before. It catches fire during a routine refueling at Wigg Bay in Scotland, and that quietly is the end of B-184. The 4th aircraft, BV-186, never gets the chance to fly a dramatic covert mission at all. Instead, it is broken up for spare parts, its components cannibalized to keep the rest of the small, secret fleet flying for as long as possible, a mundane, unglamorous fate for an aircraft that had once been part of the same death-defying flight across the North Sea as its 3 sisters. By the middle of 1942, every single one of the 4 Norwegian He-115s that escaped occupied Norway 2 years earlier is gone, lost to an unexplained explosion, destroyed by enemy fighters after a reckless daylight flight, wrecked by friendly fire and then an accidental fire, or simply stripped for parts. Z-Flight, this almost unbelievable chapter of the war involving disguised Nazi aircraft flying secret missions for British intelligence, quietly ceases to exist. And to this day, the British government has never formally, officially acknowledged that any of it happened. Everything we know comes from surviving records, veterans' accounts, and decades later, wreckage pulled up almost by accident from the seabed. But here is the part of the story that makes the He-115's secret career even stranger. The British were not the only ones who figured this out. Independently, on different fronts of the same war, at least 2 other nations reached exactly the same conclusion about this supposedly obsolete He, including, eventually, the very country that built it. Chapter 11. Finland's Jenny and the Lakes Behind the Lines rewind briefly to June 1940. Amid the collapse of Norwegian resistance, it is not only Scotland that receives a fleeing Norwegian He-115. One aircraft, designated F-50, makes it instead to Finland, arriving on the 8th of June, 1940. Finland, at that point, is between wars, having just fought the brutal Winter War against the Soviet Union and facing an uneasy pause before the next round of fighting begins, and the arriving Norwegian aircraft is initially interned, a foreign military asset sitting in a technically neutral holding pattern. That pattern doesn't last. When Finland resumes open war against the Soviet Union in 1941, in what becomes known as the Continuation War, the Finnish Air Force impresses the aircraft into its own service. They give it the nickname Jenny, and they use it for a purpose that should, by now, feel very familiar. From the summer of 1941 onward, Jenny is used by Finnish Air Force Squadron LL-14 to ferry Finnish Special Forces, Sissy troops, elite raiders trained for deep operations behind enemy lines, onto lakes situated far behind Soviet positions. Under cover of night, exactly the kind of mission where a quiet, slow, water-landing-capable aircraft is not a liability but an irreplaceable asset. Nobody in Finland needed to see the British operation in Malta to arrive at this idea. Nobody needed a memo, a slow seaplane that can land almost anywhere there is water, and that makes comparatively little noise compared to a land plane using an engine-roaring runway approach, is simply obviously useful for sneaking soldiers into places they are not supposed to be. Finland discovered this independently, using the exact same aircraft type for almost the exact same purpose, at almost the exact same time as the British were doing it in the Mediterranean. And as far as the historical record shows, neither side had any idea the other was doing it. Jenny's luck runs out on the 4th of July, 1943. Flying a mission deep in East Karelia, it is ambushed, most likely by Soviet aircraft or ground fire waiting for exactly this kind of infiltration flight, and is forced to ditch. The crew is captured. It is a sobering reminder that no amount of stealth, disguise, or clever tactical thinking makes these missions safe. It only makes them possible. Remarkably, the loss of Jenny does not end Finland's use of this aircraft type for special operations. Germany, Finland's co-belligerent against the Soviet Union at this stage of the war, actually loans Finland 2 additional He-115s specifically so the Sissy infiltration missions can continue. Which raises an almost absurd question. Did the German High Command, in authorizing this loan, understand exactly what these sea aircraft were being used for? Did they realize they were handing over more units of the same obsolete seaplane that British intelligence was, at that very moment, using for nearly identical purposes on the other side of the continent? There is no clear evidence that Berlin ever connected those dots. But it does set up the final strangest twist in this whole story. Germany itself, eventually, reaches the exact same conclusion, using its own He-115s for the exact same kind of mission that the British had pioneered years earlier, in secret, using Germany's own captured aircraft. Chapter 12. Germany's own secret weapon. If you want a single detail that captures just how genuinely well-suited the He-115 turned out to be for clandestine operations, consider this: the Luftwaffe's most secretive special operations unit of the entire war, an outfit known as Kampfgeschwader 200, KG-200, eventually adopts the He-115 for precisely the same role that British intelligence had already been running out of Malta. KG-200 is, in itself, one of the more remarkable footnotes of the Second World War, a unit so secretive that its own personnel often did not know what other detachments within the same wing were doing, tasked with everything from flying captured Allied aircraft on covert reconnaissance missions to inserting and extracting German agents behind Allied lines, using whatever aircraft type best suited a given mission's specific, brutal geography. And by the time KG-200 turns to the He-115 for exactly this purpose, the aircraft has already been formally withdrawn from every conventional combat role on every conventional front. It is not being used because it is a good combat aircraft anymore. By any conventional military measure, it has been obsolete for years. It is being used specifically because it is quiet, because it can land on water almost anywhere, and because those exact qualities that made it a liability in a dogfight make it close to ideal for sneaking someone into or out of denied territory under cover of darkness. KG-200 continues flying He-115s on agent insertion missions as late as 1944, long after every major air force in Europe had written the type off as combat obsolete, and years after the aircraft's original, proud speed record-breaking reputation had become a distant memory. Germany, in other words, eventually arrives at the exact same insight that British intelligence had already been quietly exploiting for years, using captured Norwegian examples of the very same aircraft: that a plane's greatest weakness in open battle can become its greatest strength in the shadows. 3 different air arms: Britain, using Norwegian Flown, captured German aircraft; Finland, using an intern Norwegian aircraft, later reinforced by German loans, and eventually Germany itself, all independently arrive at the same conclusion about the same airframe. None of them appears to have known, in real time, that the others were doing the same thing. It is one of the rare, almost eerie moments in military history where three separate nations, fighting on different fronts of the same global war, look at the same failed weapon and see the same hidden potential. Chapter 13, The Silence After. By the end of 1945 it is over, not just the war, but the He 115 itself as a flying functional aircraft type anywhere in the world. Not a single example remains airworthy. Production had already stopped years earlier. War losses had steadily whittled down the surviving airframes on every front, from the Arctic convoys to the Mediterranean to the lakes of Karelia, and the handful that survived to the war's end are quietly scrapped, abandoned, or left to rot in the general demobilization chaos that swept over Europe's military hardware once the fighting finally stopped. An aircraft that had once broken 8 world records, that had fought simultaneously for and against the same country in the same military campaign, that had flown spies into and out of enemy harbors in broad daylight wearing a false flag, effectively disappears from the world. For decades, the He 115 survives only in photographs, in scattered official records, many of them still incomplete or classified, and in the memories of the very small number of veterans who had actually flown it, most of whom, for the British operations at least, were bound by official secrecy that in some cases lasted the rest of their lives. Then, more than 60 years after the last one flew, the sea gives one back. Chapter 14. Raised from the deep, in 2005, a Norwegian survey vessel working near Stavanger makes an unexpected discovery on the seabed: the largely intact wreck of a Heinkel He 115, resting upside down on the bottom, having gone down decades earlier in what appears to have been a failed landing attempt in 1942. For 63 years, this particular aircraft, one that never made headlines, never flew a legendary mission, simply crashed and sank in the ordinary anonymous way that so many wartime aircraft did, has been sitting quietly in the cold, dark, oxygen-poor water off the Norwegian coast waiting. It takes another 7 years of planning, funding, and careful preparation before the wreck is finally raised. On the 2nd of June 2012, in an operation to recover the aircraft from Fjord, the He 115, a BC variant bearing the work number 2398, once part of one Staffel of Seaplane Aufklärungsgruppe 906, which had gone down on the 26th of December, 1942, is lifted out of the water and back into daylight for the first time in 7 decades. What the recovery team finds is almost unbelievable. The cold, low-oxygen conditions of the fjord have acted as a kind of natural time capsule, preserving the aircraft's aluminum structure to a degree that shocks even experienced aviation archaeologists. The airframe has barely corroded. Details that should have long since dissolved into rust and marine growth are instead still crisp, including, most strikingly of all, the aircraft's original Nazi-era markings, still legible on the metal after 63 years underwater. It is by a wide margin the most complete and best preserved He 115 known to exist anywhere in the world. A genuine time machine pulled dripping out of a Norwegian fjord. The aircraft is moved into storage and restoration at the Flyhistorisk Museum at Sola, near Stavanger, where painstaking conservation work begins. The slow, careful process of stabilizing 7 decades of saltwater damage and preparing this singular artifact for permanent display, so that a wider public can finally stand in front of a physical, tangible piece of this almost forgotten aircraft type's strange and layered history. It's a striking irony when you think about it. The most intact surviving example of an aircraft that was, for years, secretly flown by the Allies in disguise, wound up being recovered and preserved not by Britain, whose intelligence services flew it on some of its most audacious missions, but by Norway, the very country whose captured aircraft started this entire chain of events back in April 1940. Chapter 15. Fragments of a secret that was never officially Told Malta remembers its own piece of this story too, though what remains there is far smaller, far more fragmentary, and in its own way, far more haunting. For decades after the war, long after Z-Flight had ceased to exist, and long after most people on the island had forgotten or never known that a secretive seaplane unit had once operated out of Califrana, Maltese fishing crews, working the waters north of the island, occasionally net pieces of wreckage in their gear. In December 2003, one such catch is positively identified. Components from BV-185, the aircraft that exploded in that mysterious mid-air fireball on the night of September 22, 1941, killing Georges Blaise, Raoul Gatien, and Reg Drake. Those fragments, twisted, corroded pieces of aluminum and structure, pulled up almost by accident by fishermen going about entirely ordinary work, are now preserved and displayed in a museum on Malta. They are, for now, essentially the only physical evidence in existence for an operation that the British government has never formally, officially confirmed took place. No official unit history, no public memorial listing Z-Flight's operations by name. No plaque at Califrana describing the disguised Nazi seaplane that once flew agents in and out of enemy harbors under cover of darkness. Just some pieces of metal in a display case, and the deaths of 3 men on a black, moonless night over the Mediterranean, in service of a mission so secret that even honoring their sacrifice openly was for a very long time, apparently more than the British state was willing to do. Epilogue. The weapon that failed its way into history. Step back and look at the whole arc of this aircraft's life. Born in triumph, breaking 8 world speed records. Obsolete within 18 months, reduced to flying at night just to survive. Fighting, absurdly, on both sides of the same doomed campaign in Norway. Carrying 4 defiant pilots across the North Sea, in an escape that gets a fraction of the attention paid to bigger, more famous evacuations. Transformed by British intelligence into a false flag infiltration aircraft, sneaking into the harbors of the very nation that built it. Killing 3 men in an explosion that was never explained. Destroyed by its own side's fighters after a reckless, unauthorized joyride. Fired on by its own allies, precisely because its disguise worked too well. Carrying Finnish commandos onto lakes behind Soviet lines, with no knowledge of what the British were doing with the same aircraft type in the Mediterranean. And finally adopted, astonishingly, by the very Air Force that built it, the Luftwaffe's own KG-200, for the same clandestine purpose the British had already been using it for, using Germany's own stolen aircraft. 3 nations, 3 separate wars. Within the war, 1 aircraft, nobody talking to anybody else about it, yet everybody arriving, independently, at exactly the same conclusion. A plane too slow and fragile to survive daylight combat could become priceless the moment you stopped asking it to fight in the open, and asked it instead to disappear. That is the real story of the Heinkel He E-115, not a failed weapon, not a footnote next to the Spitfire and the Messerschmitt, but a supposedly obsolete seaplane that turned out to be one of the most valuable, most secret aircraft of the Second World War, flown by 4 different air forces, under at least 2 flags at once, on missions its own governments have still never officially admitted took place. Somewhere off Malta, fragments of one of those missions sit in a display case, unexplained. Somewhere in a Norwegian museum, the most intact example of the type in the world still bears the swastika it wore the day it sank, 63 years before anyone pulled it back into the light. And somewhere in files that may never be opened, the full story of how many agents this quiet, obsolete seaplane carried into enemy territory, and how many lives depended on nobody ever noticing it, is still waiting to be told.